It was right around Christmas time of 2015. I was staying in my in-laws' house. I was sleeping in my room with my very pregnant wife at the time, who was due to give birth any day. She was very uncomfortable and has been having sleep troubles. So when I left the room, she said that she was going to stay up only a little longer. The next thing I know, it sounds like something big is walking around just outside the house. Nothing, just stumbling around. I mean, it sounded like a person, but it sounded much heavier. Immediately, this struck me as odd because her parents had gone to bed and nobody would clearly be outside the house. It didn't really make much sense. I heard the noises start to go towards the back of the house, so I quickly ran to the back door. The door was made of cheap fiberglass that kind of looked like wood. I was able to see outside, but it's pretty black out there. As I'm looking out in the backyard, I can make out something huge and dark, moving around, right behind where her dad parks his truck in the driveway, right where the trees are. A quick frame of reference here. The driveway actually wraps around from the front, all the way to the back, where her dad parks most of his vehicles. He has a couple of cars, but mainly 2 different work trucks. Now, I see this thing moving around, and it looks much bigger than a person. My brain is trying to process what I'm seeing, but at the same time, I'm beginning to feel frightened. Surely this cannot be a person. I'm not quite sure how to make sense of what it is that I'm seeing. It's also roughly about 13 degrees Fahrenheit outside. There's no reason anybody should be out in the trees at this time of night. My in-laws did have neighbors, but they're pretty far apart, and they are also older. I just kept staring out this open door, trying to make sense of what I'm seeing, but I'm not even sure of what I'm seeing. And then, this thing, whatever it was, begins chasing after this deer full force. After a moment or so, this thing in the trees starts moving wildly, moving in the direction of the house. And my fear is quickly kicking up several notches, because if this is a person, I'm obviously too small and weak to guard my family. It's clear that whatever this is was probably going to walk right up to the door. At this point, I'm freaking out, trying to make sense of what it is I'm seeing, and I still have no idea. And then, all of a sudden, a doe runs out from behind the truck, and this thing, whatever it was, begins chasing after it in full force. Whatever I was looking at, I'm not exactly sure. It looked to me like a large hairy man, except it was completely black in color. I've seen black bears in Tennessee before, but this wasn't quite what I was looking at. Maybe a much larger version of an average bear, but looked nothing like a bear, if that makes any sense. I mean, this resembled more of a man or an ape, walking upright on 2 legs. And I think what startled me the most is that this thing was very man-like. Or I guess you might call it humanoid. It definitely was not a misidentification of a black bear. Black bears don't look like this. And it gave chase to this deer. Like it was crazy. The deer had run out into the road, across the street behind my in-laws' house. The thing just stopped, looked up at me for a moment. It was standing there, just staring at me. It was probably no more than around 80 yards away from me. I could see these small little glimmers of light that were its eyes. This terrified me. Then it turned its head back in the direction of the deer and kept on pressing forward after it. As soon as it cleared view, this massive black shape flees from the side of my in-laws' house, not even 20 feet away from me, and I nearly fall back on my butt. This other one goes charging after the other 2, the large shape and the deer, and I realize now that the heavy sounds of somebody walking around near the house I was hearing was actually one of these things, a second one, meaning there was one outside the house all along, and another in the trees beyond my father-in-law's truck. I wonder if they were chasing after this deer. I don't know. Did I just witness a hunt by these large hairy creatures? Do I even bother to tell my wife what had happened? How do I process this? Why was this even happening? Thank you for anybody who comments in this thread. I was spending the night with some good friends of mine from high school when I was about 21. We'd all been drinking, playing Cards Against Humanity, having a really good time. At some point, I passed out from all the pizza, liquor, and laughs. I remember waking up and I had to go use the bathroom. Something that happens when you drink with friends a lot. And just so you know, by this point, I was pretty much sober. But something made me stop and look up at the window. And I see this large shape go by. And immediately, I'm panicking, convinced somebody was trying to break in. So I'm looking around the room, but nobody else was awake. This was easily probably 2 or 3 in the morning. Everybody's passed out. I got out of bed, put on my pants with the intention of emptying my bladder, when something made me turn to look at the window one last time before heading downstairs. I have no idea what compelled me to, it's just this feeling in me. When I turned that corner, I saw the shape again moving across the yard. There were several trees between us, so it's hard for me to say exactly how big or how far away this thing was from me. But I'm positive it wasn't more than 20 yards away. What I'm almost certain about this, whatever thing was, it looked like a large dog, or something that was very tall. I don't know. The whole thing gave me really bad vibes. It still spooks me out to talk about it. So I run down the stairs, empty my bladder in the bathroom, and throw some water on my face to try and come to it. At this point, everybody's still crashed out, so I don't really bother trying to wake anybody up, telling them what I saw. I simply assume I just drank too much and make it a point to go back to bed. Now, the very next morning, I'm talking to those same friends and we're talking about last night, and I tell them, yeah, I woke up in the middle of the night and saw this large dog walking up to the house. They certainly got a kick out of that and thought I was just joking. I wasn't. Every single person there agreed with me that it was odd that I would just make something up like that. I wasn't. Up here in Canada, we certainly have a lot of wild animals, but we don't really get too much into the way of werewolves or other cryptids. Now, I've heard some rumors about Canada's west coast, specifically British Columbia, and I guess these kinds of creatures are pretty active up there, far more than a few people insist on seeing them regularly. But that's our thing here. We have some great cryptids lurking about. I was going to dub this Dogman sightings, but the thing is that there are some Dogman sightings not just in Canada, but in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, all over North America, even down south, towards Texas, Louisiana, Arizona. If you've not heard of Dogman before, these are werewolf-like creatures said to inhabit Michigan and the surrounding areas. I assume it's called the Dogman because it looks like a dog, as far as the build goes, but it has characteristics of a man, such as walking upright on 2 legs. They're bigger than most dogs, about the size of a wolf, if not larger. They also have long hair, and sometimes fur as well. Sometimes, it's said to be completely covered in hair, and not unlike that of an ape, while other times there seems to be patches of flesh showing through the thick covering of hair. I guess that would make sense if it's something that changes between human-like form and wolf-like form. They're usually said to have glowing yellow eyes, but sometimes red or even blue eyes are reported. They can supposedly be up to 6 feet tall. It's supposed to kill in its own kind as well as humans, leaving the bodies far from water and not eating any of them. What's strange about this is that while I don't necessarily believe in the shape-shifting from man to wolf, I believe this is a type of creature instead. It's been spotted in so many regions and remains an imminent threat to our society if ultimately left unchecked. These are what I believe to be alpha predators that we're talking about here. It's not just something that can be shrugged off. The thing is, though, these sightings are becoming more and more common, and there have been some videos, I guess, taken of this creature. I'm hoping this means that people will start to protect themselves and take this whole thing more seriously, assuming that they are proven to exist beyond the realm of just imagination. There are a lot of theories about why these dogmen are appearing, and why it's been active for so long. Is it truly a shapeshifter? Are they people who were attacked by one of these things and having their DNA rewritten? Are the stories about them true? Or are they just stories about fabricated tales told around the campfires to keep us wary of the darkness? One of the scariest dogman encounters I was told about personally was from back in 2014, when a man who I'll name as Jim was camping out with his girlfriend. They were in Michigan, and they spotted one of these so-called creatures walking upright. I guess he was able to get some pictures and even got a quick video before this thing snarled at him and scurried off. He might have been a great distance away, but this thing gave him the goosebumps. Jim's girlfriend also freaked out once she saw the image on his camera, which didn't surprise me. Jim was later on arrested and all of his equipment confiscated, which I find very strange. In 2017, a woman named Denise was taking her dogs to a park when she saw one of these creatures on a dirt road ahead of them. She stopped and tried to take a picture when her phone suddenly malfunctioned. It appeared like this creature was going to charge at them, so she didn't want to stay and watch. Her boyfriend also said that the creature looked like it was trying to mimic a human. He was with Denise. She said she did not see anything in its eyes but bloodlust, and noted that she saw an intelligence in this creature, more so than any other wild animal she had ever seen. It's unknown if there are really more dogmen than there were before, or if the number of sightings are simply increasing since more people are out and about in the wilderness. Either way, you can look at it as though this is a cryptid that has been feared by indigenous peoples for generations. I'd like to find out if these things really do exist, so we could figure out just how to fight back against them. I was 7 when this happened, and the year was 1992. I remember walking home from my grandparents' house at like 11 p.m. on a late summer night. It was very hot that night. I remember. Really sticky. As I was walking home, it's pretty humid, about 1.5 miles long. But my parents trusted me. We were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, so didn't really have to worry about predators. I decided to take a shortcut through the woods next to my house, or I should say that would lead to my house. Little did I know, this night would be one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life. My family and I used to live in this 2-story house with 3 other families. We all shared a backyard, a laundry room, kitchen, bedrooms, etc. So you would often see everybody and everything happening all around your home. Even when we moved out years later, our neighbors still talked about how the dogman likes to come into their backyard sometimes during the night. At the time, my parents never told me about this. Rightfully so. I would have been terrified. Now, I'm walking back, and I see this large dog in the back portion of our yard. I stop and think for a minute. The whole thing just didn't seem right. I mean, I know all animals that shared our yard with us, and no way this dog was it. It looked very out of place, and this shape was standing very still next to the fence, like it had been caught and was just wanting me to go away. My instinct told me, no, screamed at me to run into the house. But I didn't listen. I kept walking towards it. As I got closer, There was something about this figure that just made me want to get as far away as possible. And as soon as my front feet hit that front portion of the yard that night, I decided to run for help. When I got into the house and upstairs, my parents, when everybody else was awake, they asked what had happened. Of course, I told them I saw the creature in the yard. This is when things got weirder. It was in this moment I realized that the thing stood next to the fence was not a dog. It was covered in hair. Its face looked like an actual wolf's or a coyote's. It had yellow eyes that you could see from the streetlight outside too, because this was not the first time I saw it. My dad really wanted me to show him where it was, and I refused, telling him I didn't want to see it anymore. This night alone left me with nightmares of what I saw, and all the weird feelings about being home alone after dark for years after this had happened. A few months ago, I got a call from my girlfriend in the middle of the night, asking me to come over and check on the noises that were coming from on her roof in the backyard. We'd been dating for a while, but weren't quite at the very spend every night together stage yet. I was kind of pissed to start with, as I'd had an early shift at work. It was unlikely that I'd be able to get even shut-eye after all. I mean, with whatever she needed me to deal with, I was there. I was hoping it would earn me some brownie points. Plus, she sounded pretty freaked out. So, this was my big chance to put the big white knight armor on and come to her saving. When I pulled up into her driveway, she was peering out nervously from behind the door, waiting for me. I jogged up to the house. She pulls me inside, slamming the door behind me. I wondered for a second if this was all just a ploy of hers, and she had really just asked me to come over for some surprise booty call. But something was off. The look of sheer terror in her eyes soon put pay to that idea, and her next words chilled me. "He's come down off the roof. He's in the backyard." Whoa. He? When she called me, she'd said there were noises, like skittering and banging, as if there was some animal up there or even a really large big bird. Now, all of a sudden, it was a he. I felt a whole lot less brave all of a sudden. I might have been okay with scaring away a raccoon, but a person could easily have a gun. "Did you call the cops?" I'd asked her, wondering why 911 wasn't the first port of call, and me second. Again, those terrified eyes looked at me, and she shook her head no. "No cops. Not for this." I was about to ask why not, and just what on earth did she expect little old unarmed me to do against some potentially violent and crazed offender. She added this: "It's best I just show you." Now, I've heard some crazy stories in my time. Growing up, my mom loved those magazines that cover things like, three-headed cows and I married my freezer, that kind of stuff. She also loved watching any kind of TV show that involved people hunting ghosts or talking about when they met an alien. I have always 100% thought it was complete and utter BS. Maybe those people were crazy, and they believed their own stories, but not me. There was no way anything like that could ever be possible. Which was why, as I stared into my girlfriend's backyard, which was semi-illuminated by a security light on the porch, at first, I just could not believe my eyes. Standing close to the fence, as if I'm trying to make up its mind or whether to jump over or not, was what I can only describe as a lizard man. A reptilian humanoid, if you want to get all conspiracy theory and technical, I guess. He was tall, over 6 feet and slender. He appeared naked. Not that lizards are famous for wearing clothes, but, His entire body was a kind of gray and scaly. His limbs long and lean. He also appeared to have webbed feet and hands. But the freakiest part of all was his head. Oval-shaped with 2 huge eyes that had very distinctive lizard-like appearance. You know, the pupil is long, rather than a small circle. 2 small nostril holes, and then a thin, wide mouth, which every so often darted this tongue and sharp teeth. My mind was whirling, and I asked how long he'd been there. She replied that the noises on the roof had started about a half hour ago. She called me, and she heard this sort of slithering or wet noise coming from the backyard. She'd snuck down, having no clue what to expect, and had one heck of a shock. He'd been stood there ever since, not making any contact or trying to come inside. But, nevertheless, his mere presence being utterly terrifying. I still wondered what exactly she wanted me to do, since I don't talk to lizards, and was on the verge of a meltdown myself just from seeing this dude, when all of a sudden he spun around, scaled the fence inhumanly, and vanished. I grabbed a flashlight, which she had stood on the counter, and ran into the yard, opening the gate and looking into the woods that stretches for miles behind her house. No sign. She came back to my place and hasn't been able to sleep on her own since. Sometimes, we do stay at her place, and thankfully, there have been no more noises or sightings. Where did he come from? What did he want? How many more of him are out there, or did he just take on human form again? If you believe some of the crazies. I guess we'll probably never know. I work for a sewage plant. It's one of those jobs, much like people that collect trash or clean public restrooms. Nobody really wants, and everybody thinks is a dirty job. But without us, the cities would be crawling with filth. Literally. I have a series of pretty mundane jobs at the actual plant. But, once in a while, a call comes in about something, which means, yes, we have to go down into the sewers, into the underbelly of the cities, and work on whatever the problem is down there. And yes, fatbergs are just as horrific as they look on TV. There is nothing remotely pleasant about those tunnels, but I just get on. No point complaining or making a meal of it. However, I also never lose focus. You have to keep your wits about you, and your eye on the job at hand. I've seen rats the size of cats, or even small dogs down there. After all, it is their territory. They are not in the least bit scared of me, and have even attacked before in the past. We've also found stuff that makes absolutely no sense. Things that couldn't have gone down any toilet or plug hole. You can't even begin to imagine their journey. A buddy once made the most gruesome discovery that any of us have come across so far. A hobo had come down somehow and froze to death. No one reported him missing, and it was weeks before we had a call to go down there for something unrelated. That was a hell of a mess, and my colleague still gets nightmares. Although I'm eternally grateful that it wasn't me that stumbled across that corpse. At least there was a solid explanation behind it. At least we had closure on how and why it happened. Now, my story has no such plausible reasoning. Let me tell you why. Oftentimes, we work in pairs or even teams for safety reasons. But, as with everything, times were hard, and there had been redundancies. If you could do a job alone, then you would. No extra bodies available for backup, which was why I found myself down in the sewers on a routine check after a call about a simple blockage. I'd been down there now for about an hour when I heard a noise. Now, clearly, that is not unusual in and of itself. There are all sorts of things constantly moving around down there, but this noise was quite strange, almost like a clicking, and then an occasional tapping. I had never heard anything quite like it. I mean, either down there or on the surface. I just could not place what it could be. There are quite a few crossroads and T-junctions in the tunnels, It would be easy to get lost if you didn't know your way about. And as I was approaching one now, something large darted in front of me. Now, when I say large, I don't mean the size of a dog rat. I mean something getting on towards my own height. It moved super fast, and I just got a flash of blurry green as it flew past me. But I assumed, as why on earth would I think otherwise, that it was a person. An unauthorized person, as I was the only worker on call there. And that meant they were either up to no good, a danger to themselves, or both. I quickly followed suit, calling out that I was an official worker, and he should stop so I could escort him out safely. I must have chased him out of the tunnels for a good 5 minutes before it halted in front of me. Although visibility was poor, I did have a headlamp on, and the helmet was a little big, so the light kept bouncing around. But I was being vigilant, making sure my footing was on point and I didn't fall, while keeping an eye to make sure the figure was still moving in front of me. But other than a shadowy blur, I still hadn't gotten anywhere near a decent look at him yet. However, as often happens to newer colleagues, or indeed people who should not be down there, he'd taken a wrong turn, and we were at a dead end, which now meant I could face him, and the only way out would be to come back and pass right by me. Now, I was stationary and a lot closer. My headlamp cast a good light upon him, but what I saw from the back didn't make a lickety-split of sense. The only thing I could think of in that moment was that I had stumbled upon a very dedicated Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle cosplayer, and literally nothing else would have added up. He was facing the wall, but very clear view of his back. It showed me an intricate and no doubt very expensive looking lizard-like skin. His legs were very thick and muscular, lots of rippling muscles, and his head was kind of bent forward. Then he, which I still assume is he, slowly turned around to face me. Now, I wasn't sure which of the Ninja Turtles I was expecting, but this guy looked nothing like a turtle, like I originally thought. It looked like a man-sized iguana or something, just this frightening look on its face, like how dare I corner it. And right at that moment, I don't know who was more surprised or terrified. I was face to face with something that shouldn't possibly exist. A man-sized iguana lizard thing, standing there on 2 legs. Half man, half lizard, I thought. Man, maybe the sewage mutated this person or something. I don't know. I was incredibly frightened. And something that I hadn't mentioned before is that I love animals. I have 3 rescue cats and 2 dogs that I've saved. I had no plan on hurting this being, no matter how disturbing it was. So I slowly backed away. I kept my eyes on it, and it kept its gaze locked on me, staring intently, making this very agitated clicking noise, like it was going to strike at any moment, like a snake. Eventually, I waited for a few moments and then turned around and ran, returning back to my original location and task at hand. Although I often think about this experience, you're the first person I've told. Don't get me wrong, if anybody ever reported an attack, I would tell. But until then, I'm not sure why that I feel I want to keep it a secret. Maybe for the fact that if I said anything, my career could be jeopardized, or be... I live on a very busy working ranch, with a team of people constantly helping to keep the place going. The animals need a lot of care, and we get a ton of visitors, all whilst we treat the animals with the most respect. They are part of the ranch after all, and not just pets, each having a vital role to play. That said, it is impossible to not get attached. Rusty is an older mare, and a firm favorite of mine. She's a good girl, allowing all the little uns to pet and ride her. Never had a problem. So, when one of the ranch hands had reported that he'd been in to feed her and she'd kicked him, I knew something was up. Turned out she had some pretty nasty cuts to her belly and was in a considerable amount of pain. I was livid. We locked all of the animals up safely each and every night. How could this have happened? But we treated it as a terrible yet unfortunate accident. We made sure to take extra care of her to ensure everything was secure the next night. The next morning, I awoke to yet another mysterious and horrific incident. All of the chickens having been killed. Some of them literally ripped to pieces, yet they didn't seem to have been dragged away or eaten. I was still wondering what the hell could have caused the injuries to the horse, and now something had created utter carnage and devastation, but yet had not eaten them. After finding out about the latest devastation, a couple of the workers refused to come in. They'd been on the ranch for years, never so much as a sick day, and yet were so spooked by the events, they were abandoning me. I was angry to start, but realized they were scared, although they refused to tell me why exactly. There were, of course, various predators that lived in the wilds surrounding the ranch. We weren't the only living things in the area, but I was still baffled as to what could have possibly seemingly climbed over the stable door without any trace to hurt just Rusty. And also, what would kill the chickens but not eat them? It was like something clever was targeting them. But what? That night, I stayed up and kept watch through the kitchen door, where I had sight of the stables. The ranch was silent. I'd sent my wife and kids off to her mother's, just in case we were dealing with some unknown predator. I kept the lights off, just the dull glow of my phone keeping me company, and my shotgun in hand. Somewhere around 2 a.m, I heard a very distinct noise. I sat up, shutting off my cell so it was now pitch black, and opening the door just enough to poke the gun through, my finger tightly on the trigger. The sound again came and I froze. What was it? It was laughter, which was terrifying in and of itself, since I had very much been expecting an animal intruder, not a human. But even worse was that I recognized that very distinctive laugh. It was my mother's, only she had been dead these last 5 years. And then I saw something that made absolutely no sense, even less than hearing a voice from the grave. The intruder stepped out of the shadows in the security light over by the stables, and the light tripped on, revealing just what was the cause of all the attacks. Standing in the light was some sort of weird coyote, not what you'd expect as an alpha predator. Only this was no ordinary animal. It was standing on its hind legs, giving the appearance it was human-like. It started to make its way on those 2 legs over to the stable door when I heard it laugh again. Not even remotely the sound which any kind of creature emits. That was enough. I aimed, took a shot. Bang! It gave a very human-sounding scream and ran off with impossible speed. I flung open the door, gave chase, but I had very little light. I could not see where it had gone. I shot off another couple of warnings, and then went back to calm the horses, who were very worked up and jittery due to the noise and the situation. The next morning, one of the workers who had the day before refused to come in asked to speak to me. I was throwing down some strong cowboy coffee, having been unable to sleep a week after the incident. And this particular employee was more like a friend of the family. He'd been with us for years, and I was glad of his working knowledge of the ranch and the incredible stories he loved to tell. You see, he was of Navajo descent, actually, and his parents had grown up on a local res. He was always very friendly, helpful, and had a smile for my kids. Right then, however, He looked years older and scared. That only increased when I told him about my latest encounter. In the end, he took me to see a very old medicine man, who was literally the only person who could help. He told me that I had encountered a skinwalker, somebody who had succumbed to bad magic and was able to actually mimic the animal of which they wore the skin of for a short time. Several things would give them away. Even though they wore an animal form, they would still often move like a human, behave like one. Their eyes would still be human-esque, and thankfully, I hadn't gotten that close. They were also apparently able to mimic voices, including those of people who had passed, either to lure victims or just mess with them and cause mischief. Their attacks were often very personal. The medicine man asked if I had done something against a native person, whether on purpose or unwittingly. I couldn't think of anything, and neither could my employee. In the end, the elder blessed my land and did a few things I wasn't allowed to ask about or know of, but I can happily say that there's been no trace of this creature or skinwalker ever since. A few years ago, I was having a hard time at school, at home, and even with my girlfriend. Things were really getting to me, and I was having trouble sleeping. Because of this, I often took real late walks in the woods behind the suburb where I lived, which backed onto a real fancy golf course. The grounds were beautiful. It was one of the only country club places that cost a fortune. But the woods surrounding it were public, and there were no issues with me being there at night. I never saw anybody else. No late joggers or dog owners. I mean, who would you expect to be out walking at 2 a.m.? It wasn't exactly like a zoo in there, but at the same time, there were plenty of regular woodland animals, and oftentimes, I would scare one by accident, since, nighttime is their time. But they never tried to attack or anything. Some annoyed chittering was about as much of a telling off as I would get. Although I was pretty sure that I was the only other person I would ever meet out there. It would either be a sleepwalker who traveled really far or somebody else like myself suffering from insomnia. I was always nevertheless careful as I walked around, just to be on the safe side. I didn't think any escaped convicts would bother coming here, or potential serial killers, but you still gotta keep your eyes open. So, when I heard a very distinct sound, that of another person talking, or maybe better to describe it as mumbling, I wasn't afraid, but I was also on very high alert. The closer I got to the sound, the more concerned I grew. Not because I thought it was anything weird or unexplainable, but because the incoherent mumbling sounded like somebody who was drunk or high. I didn't want to scare them and have them attack me, but equally, I felt some kind of civic duty to make sure they were okay and not hurt. The woods can be an amazingly relaxing and safe place if you know the trails. It can be scary and dangerous as hell if you can't see where you're going, because you've got sunk too many times or smoked too much weed. I had a flash on my cell, pretty useless, just emitting a pathetic beam, but it was better than nothing. Now, the closer I got to the strange noise, I noticed a really bad smell. Definitely the kind of stink that I would usually associate with maybe a dead animal. I was again beginning to worry about what this person had done. Although we don't exactly have a lot of tweakers, I know what meth and PCP can do to people. I didn't really want to come face to face with some dude eating a dead deer raw or something gross like that. Looking back at it now, I almost kind of wish it was that. At least that would have been a plausible explanation. As I turned the corner and approached the small clearing where I believed the person to be, I shone the flash on my cell, trying my best to see what I was up against. What I saw made no sense at all. It definitely was not a person, although it was as tall as me, maybe even bigger. That was only because it had brought itself up on 2 legs, rather than the 4 it should have been standing up on. You see, standing by one of the trees, quite steadily on 2 hind legs and muttering, intelligible but still very much human words, was some sort of deer. A stag to be precise. It had huge antlers, and looked like they could do some real damage. To say I was stunned would be a huge understatement. I stood there just staring at it, and the fear didn't set in for a moment or two. I was in such shock. I mean, who wouldn't be? Here, I was expecting some drunk guy who'd wandered from the bar and gotten lost, or some junkie who'd rolled into town and taken too much meth before chowing down on Bambi. Instead, I got a human-sized, 2-legged talking giant stag. The fear was about as real as it seemed to notice me, and the muttering stopped immediately. It gave this strange noise, which I've heard actual deer make before. That was it. I'm not afraid to tell you that I almost needed new pants. I ran, and ran, and ran, and ran, and ran, all the way back to my house. I tripped so many times and I was panicking. Not much better than what it was. Although I was covered in scratches and bruises, but that was better than what could have happened to me back there. You see, it suddenly dawned on me exactly what this thing was. How was it possible for me to be seeing something that shouldn't exist? It wasn't some weird form of a man or beast hybrid. The only possible explanation that this was a skinwalker. The only thing was, I literally have no idea what it was doing here, or who it was after. Was it possibly expecting somebody in those woods, or was it expecting me? Back in the early 70s, I saw something that I will never be able to fully understand, and will certainly never forget. I was just a teen at the time, and even now, I can still vividly see him. Growing up on the Jersey Shore, we spent a lot of our time on the beaches and in the water. There would be an occasional shark sighting now and again, and the beaches would be closed off. But it never lasted for long, and certainly on the stretch of beach we frequented, there weren't any actual attacks. Of course, that didn't mean that the sharks weren't out there, or that they weren't killing other things in the ocean. And sometimes, we'd run down to the shore after school let out, and find all sorts of half-eaten creatures that had washed up after Sharky had finished with their snack. Being teens, we were more morbidly fascinated rather than grossed out by it. It was often more a case of what was the sickest looking thing we could find. And I'm pretty sure the octopus that washed up with each of its tentacles bitten off halfway was one of the closest times I came to losing my lunch. But despite all of this, we never actually ever saw a shark. I wish we had, because what we did see one day, back in the early 70s, was way more frightening than any great white shark. And to this day, I have no idea exactly what it was. It was the end of summer, and it was evening time. Now, you may well have gotten an image in your head of the boardwalk, and the places in Jersey which are heaving with tourists, and I apologize if I was misleading, as this particular area I'm referring to, where we used to hang out, wasn't so much private, but it was a bit more off the beaten track, so only locals tended to visit, which was fine by us, as oftentimes it was just there. Anyway, so, it was late summer, late evening, but not yet night, so it was getting dark, but we could still see okay. And what we saw, I'm just gonna come out and say it. We saw a gator man, or as I describe it later on, because we're not the only people to see this thing. A humanoid alligator. I was real grateful. I had some buddies with me at the time. Not just because it scared the crap out of me, but so I could prove I wasn't lying or hallucinating or something. After all, it was the 70s, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people were still using acid or smoking weed. But to be clear, we were not. In fact, we were all sober, and had been. Hell, my dad was a cop. He'd have beaten me black and blue if I ever did a drug. So, there were 4 of us, all completely sober, and we all saw this Gator man. The best way I can describe him is he looked like a real tall alligator. Like, instead of having those tiny squat little limbs, so it looks like they're wandering about on their belly, it had arms and legs, the size and length of a person, but still covered in scales with claws, and a full of gator head with that long snout and huge teeth. It had reared up out of nowhere, in the ocean, but close enough for us to be able to see it. I think the water came up to like where its knees would have been. I have no idea what it did then, or where it went off to, because you can bet your bottom dollar that we ran out of there as fast as we possibly could, and did not look back. There were quite a few sightings of him that summer, enough for us to believe that it wasn't some sort of hallucination. But then he disappeared. What he was, why he was there, I'll never know, but I'll never forget him. When I was in college, I took a road trip with my roommate back to her home in Ohio for Thanksgiving. It was a long drive, to say the least, but the promise of a week of home cooking and free laundry was more than enough to make the journey worth it. My roommate was a lot of fun and came from a huge family, most of which I'd be meeting over the next few days, so the trip went by fairly quickly, as she joyously told me the various stories featuring Uncle Lenny or her cousin Susie. We made sure to take plenty of rest stops and even had lunch at a mom and pop's roadside diner. We texted her mom whenever we had bars or service to let her know our progress. Things were going great. Then, we came to this strip of highway that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. It was like something straight out of a serial killer movie, and we laughed and joked about finding a broken down car on the side of the road. A Bundy-esque dude just waiting to club us over the head. Of course, since I'm writing into you to tell you this story, you know that didn't happen. Also, you talk about cryptid monsters and not humans. Anyway, whilst we were laughing and planning on how we would escape and be final girls, we did see something on the side of the road. But it was Bundy or BTK, obviously. This thing seemed much smaller than a person to start with. And as we got closer, at first, we presumed to be it was some kind of dog. I don't know why, to be honest, because even as we were approaching it, I could tell that it appeared to be a greenish color, and dogs don't tend to be that sort of shade. It also appears to stand up, because we could see legs. So, and we still are a little bit away. It looks like we are approaching something smallish, maybe around 4 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs, and green. I can very distinctly remember that as we drove past it, as we were literally eye to eye looking at it out of the passenger window. Neither of us said a word. We were both completely silent for a good 5 to 10 minutes afterwards. My roomie did not slow down at all, but she didn't speed up either. We just kept rolling. Finally, I do remember folding my hands onto my lap and staring straight ahead out the windshield. Not looking at my buddy, I simply said, "Did you just see that really tall frog standing up like a person?" She then burst out in what seemed like a relieved laughter and exclaimed yes. We both had a nervous laugh for a bit, and to be honest, I'm not too sure that either of us could fully quite comprehend exactly what we had just driven past. I mean, it's not exactly an everyday occurrence to see Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows stood by the side of the road, is it? Of course, this guy wasn't dressed in clothes. That would be ridiculous. But he was like the size of a human child, and he was most definitely upright, on two bowed legs, not crouched down, ready to jump on all four, like a regular frog would. It honestly went through my mind that maybe we had been poisoned or drugged by the coffee at the diner, because it couldn't possibly be real. But if we were, then we showed no other signs or symptoms. So what the hell did we see? Is there really a species of tall two-legged frogs roaming the highways out here in Ohio? Was he trying to hitchhike? We'll never know. But we still often think about that frogman and what he is up to these days. I mean, after all, I think there was a pretty large swamp or marshland nearby. Either way, we try to make jokes about it, but it's still freaky because we both saw the exact same thing. I work in the mailroom for a huge corporate business. The hours are long, tedious, and repetitive, but the paycheck is good, and the company I have down there, even better. To keep ourselves from going mad, we often tell each other stories. Since we're all over 18, we will often try and freak each other out. Despite the business being worth millions, the mailroom is still a bit of a throwback, and although our working area is fine, and the break room and bathrooms are clean, there are still a few old, dark, and dingy storage areas down there. I see myself as a bit of a master storyteller, and had been busy memorizing as much long creepypasta as I could find to keep the mantle of King of Creepy going as I possibly could. Urban legends, crappy remakes and sequels to movies that no one had ever watched, so they didn't know how the plotline went. I loved it. As soon as my shift started, I had people begging me to tell them more and more spooky stuff. So, in a way, it was typical that what happened down in one of those dark, damp, and dingy storerooms happened to me, as literally no one believed me. They all thought it was just another one of my stories, or that I was setting them up for a prank. But I wasn't. As I have already mentioned, the actual warehouse part where we spent most of our time, and the parts of the building that we used for breaks, was absolutely fine, and had been fitted out with damp proofing, AC in the summer, heaters in the winter. But, shut away down various old corridors was the oldest part of the building, where you only went once in a blue moon if you needed something specific. And it just so happened that a fuse had blown in the plug for the microwave, and, me being me, volunteered to head down to one of the rooms designated as a random storage, as I was sure that I had seen a box of batteries and other stuff down there. It had been raining non-stop for the last week or so, and it smelled even damper than usual the further I headed. There was obviously electricity down there and lighting, just no heat, so it always smelled kind of rusty and a thick must. The walls even felt damp sometimes. The closer I got to the room, I thought that I could hear a sort of snuffling noise. I'm sure by now you figured I probably don't scare easy, but I still didn't want to come face to face with a rat, since they carry all sorts of nasty diseases. So, although not scared, I had my guard up, just in case. I did have my favorite work boots on, and I was a mean kicker, especially during school football. The noise got louder as I approached the door of the storeroom. It almost sounded wet, like something swallowing. It's really hard to describe. I threw open the door, my leg out in front of me, ready to kick or stomp on something. I don't know. It just felt like I needed to be ready for something. I pulled on the cord for the light, and the moment the room was illuminated, I saw it. And I will tell you exactly what I saw the best that I can. It was big. Not as big as me. But then, I'm only 6'4", and not many people are. But I figured it was easily over 5 feet. Whatever this was standing upright, on 2 legs just like you or me. It had very tiny arms that it held in front of itself. Not long, except it was at the side. It was very dark green, grainy looking, and scaly. I can 100% say that it looked lizard-like, because it had a very lizard head and face. It had a very long lizard mouth, and even a nose that looked very lizardy. Big, bugged-out yellow eyes on either side of its huge face. It looked freaky, but not necessarily fierce. This thing stood about 15 feet away from me, and was a small man-sized 2-footed lizard. I was convinced I was looking at some sort of alien, some sort of lizard alien. It looked at me, and I looked at him, or her, or it. It was androgynous. I'm saying him. I have no damn idea what sex it was. I slowly backed out and slammed the door. I ran back to the mailroom and told the others what I'd seen. I was met with an eruption of laughter, clapped on my back, and offered high fives. A couple of them said they believed me and came back down to the room to see for themselves. But of course, nothing. So it went down as a great prank, another super story. Only I know what I saw. How it got down there, I have no idea. I know there are old windows on the far side of that storage room that could easily fit a large person through. But those haven't been messed with in a long time. And there are thick forest and woods surrounding the outside of this unit. Who knows? Do I really believe this thing came through the window and was stalking and waiting for the right time in that room? Not really. But I can't think of another reason why this thing was there. My granddad was a sailor, and he used to tell us all sorts of crazy stuff that he saw in the sea. In fact, a lot of the time, he would have a twinkle in his eye and the ghost of a smile as he told us. Like the time he supposedly met Blackbeard the pirate, or discovered an underwater city of gold. But there was one story that no matter how many times he retold it, I never saw that twinkle. And that makes me think of the stuff he used to make up to entertain us. This particular tale was true, to my belief. They were somewhere near the Caribbean when it happened. Now, before anybody jumps to conclusions, my grandfather has now been dead for at least 20 years. I heard this story when I was around 10, so that's 30 years ago, and it happened when he was younger than I am now. So he was not inspired by or retelling of a famous movie featuring Jack Sparrow. He and the crew had been aboard the ship for around a week or so, and everything was going well. They were well on track for whatever their end destination was, and in good spirits. Most of the men at the time were below deck, doing what sailors do. That's when a large splash was heard. A very large splash. Not remotely unusual when you're in the middle of the ocean, of course. But something told him to look out over the side of the ship. At first, he couldn't see what manner of creature was responsible for the sound, but he could see ripples in the water below. He seemed to recall it was around dusk, So, although the blazing sun wasn't high in the sky, it was by no means completely dark yet. He also wasn't in the slightest bit frightened, merely curious, as if it were somehow playing with him. The creature refused to come back up to the surface whilst he was watching. He could see bubbles, so he knew something was down there. A lot of the sea life he had encountered were quite nosy, and he'd seen many dolphins, and even an octopus come right up to the ship, as if to say, "What are you doing in my ocean?" Knowing these things can be playful, he stepped back from the side of the ship, so his sightline of the water was obscured. And sure enough, as soon as he had moved back, he heard 2 loud splashes again, and a bang, and something bumped up against the bottom of the ship. Still not thinking it was anything that would be a potential threat, he raced back over to try and catch a glimpse. And he was rewarded by catching sight of the very end of a vibrant aqua-green tail fin diving back under the water. He remembers thinking that it was the most beautiful color, and also, what on earth must be the fish that the tail fin was on? By now, his curiosity had peaked, but was still not afraid. Backing away slowly, he made sure he was out of sight. But this time, he crept quietly to the edge of the ship so that could pop up instantly and see what was down there. Maybe he discovered a new breed of fish. As I said, he was curious and now excited to see exactly what was playing hide and seek with him. He heard a bump and a splash, and this time shot up as quick as he could to look over the side. As I've said, whenever Granddad told us about meeting Long John Silver or surviving a battle with a kraken, we knew he was full of it, embellishing things to entertain us. He'd get really animated as he told us, and it often ended up with him making us jump and then smothering us in kisses. But I swear, when he told us this, there was none of that. If you can believe it, he actually paled, and there was a slight tremor to his voice. That was because this time, when he looked over, he did catch a fleeting glance of what was playing with him. It was a mermaid. Don't be fooled for 1 second that this thing had anything in common with Ariel. The best way that he was able to describe its body was that it looked like Nosferatu with long hair, a gnarled bony body, and a fin. Can you even imagine that? Nosferatu's twisted features with huge warped fangs, wide gaping eyes, but instead of a bald head, long straggly wet hair covered and thick in seaweed. Then, instead of a human body, the rancid, almost concave bony structure with visible ribs and 2 shriveled, wrinkled chest bones. The only thing to indicate properly that it was indeed a creature of another world. The only thing similar to the Disney film was her fin, which was indeed quite beautiful, and the scales shimmered in the setting sun. Of course, as soon as the creature realized it had been seen, it dove back under the water and never resurfaced. Granddad said of course they all knew the legends of sirens who were meant to be beautiful enchantresses who lured sailors with their beauty and song, and then usually killed them and ate them. If that had been a siren, then it must have taken a very drunk or desperate man to succumb. Whatever it was, it absolutely terrified my father and my granddad. He never saw anything like it again. But a year or so after that, he stopped sailing permanently and swore to always stay on land from then on out. Thanks for hearing my story. My determination to never own a car is what ultimately led up to the building blocks of this very story. I can't afford to completely live off the grid, but I do everything I can to distance myself from life of dependence. You know, I don't use money unless I have to. I won't be caught dead using a bank. I earn only as much money as I'll have to use. Everything else I try to accomplish with my own two hands. The system wants to shackle these hands. Your hands too. I think it's because of the determination to resist that I ended up having this encounter in the first place. Some of the money that I can't do without is my bus fare. I will not own a vehicle, so I need to get to where I'm going with the buses that are always crawling all over Manhattan. It's not a bad way to do things. It beats being tied down to a payment and repairs and maintenance costs. Gosh, and freaking insurance. So, when you're taking the bus as often as I, you get to know the patterns of the faces of the people that you see. You get a feel for who works in the morning, or who has errands to run in the afternoon, or who the night workers are. Just for the hay of it, I began taking different buses just to see the different crowds. It took me several runs to see it, but I began to catch on to that no matter which bus I was on, there was always one person that always was there with me. He was an old man that looked like an old woman if you didn't look close enough. He looked a little on the homeless side, a little on the mentally ill side. He looked a little on every side. A virtual human kaleidoscope with an oversized cowboy hat that's been crushed more than once. A Hawaiian shirt that was usually unbuttoned, and pink shorts and sneakers. He was always carrying some variation of paper or plastic shopping bags. He never smiled, and never really made eye contact with anyone. You'd think somebody that loud would stand out right away, but I can't describe the way he always kind of blended in with everything. I mean, he was so out there. He was ordinary. Anyway, no matter which bus I took, there was at some point a crazy idea beginning to form in the back of my head that would not be ignored. I got the notion that he was following me, so I was going to follow him back. The first few times I tailed him, I really didn't think he was aware of me, but I've been doing things long enough to know the revelation comes with persistence. He would stay on the bus for several cycles to the route, as if it were a means of sightseeing. But then, he would get off at a stop and sit down and wait for another bus. Then, he'd ride that one through its route several times. I don't think I ever observed him stopping to use the bathroom anywhere. He just kept going. My bladder and bowels would always seem to scream before his did. Things came to a head that day, and I had finally given up and decided that he was just a derelict old man that had nothing better to do with his twilight years than surf the mass transit system the way most people of later generations surf the internet. Well, then he got off at the downtown junction, where all the routes converged at once. He got off the bus, waited for another one, got on. I kid you not, no more than 10 minutes later, a completely different bus arrived and the same guy got off, waited, got on. Either those buses did some serious moving in 10 minutes, or something else was up. I did some acid back in my younger days, and I started to wonder if those permanent tendencies towards flashbacks were a culprit. But the notion started to gel in my head that there was one of him on every single bus at any given time. The more I shadowed him, the more I watched how often the buses would trade him at the junction. That became the only viable explanation. I started going to ridiculous lengths, working longer hours so I could have more money to buy those little micro cams that are so cheap nowadays I could collect footage from different buses. I know that sounds crazy, but the way we're kept asleep and oblivious to all this stuff is even crazier. Catching on to this was just part of the way I was becoming awakened. Sure enough, he was everywhere. Nobody else was everywhere, just him. He never met himself. His movements were perfectly coordinated, so that two of him would never be seen in the same place at the same time. I couldn't think of any purpose this arrangement would serve, until it hit me while I was relocating one of my cameras. Surveillance. They were somebody's eyes and ears. It would be too obvious if it were the bus driver. Put it up to somebody that is so ordinary and so quiet that nobody gives them a second look. I felt woke in that moment. I felt empowered. I had all the footage I needed to make my case and put together like a documentary. All I needed was something involving a confrontation. Candid footage of me calling him out without giving him a chance to rehearse. I made my move at one of the times that he was at the downtown junction, very early on in the morning, when he was really the only person there. I came on strong, like I might know even more than I was letting on. His eyes roamed me up and down, like some sort of mechanical scan. I became aware of a hissing sound that coincided with his breathing. He looked me in the eyes, but then somehow looked into me. I felt invaded, like he could see me without my clothes on. My vision tunneled, and he was at the focus of it all. Then, his lips moved and made some series of syllables that I couldn't derive words from. Green scales appeared on his skin, as if they had been retracted inside of his pores or something. A long tongue even darted out between his lips and wagged at me, and he made the first facial expression I had ever seen on him. A sinister grin, revealing multiple pointed, jagged teeth. Then, I felt like I was hit in the face with a sledgehammer. I woke up underneath one of the small trees surrounding the downtown junction. I didn't know how long I was out, but it felt late. I wasn't missing anything. I had one of the cams in the breast pocket of my hoodie when he turned snake-like in front of me. I thought I was going to strike a big one in the name of woke. But when I got my cams and stuff home, they had been wiped. All footage I'd ever taken just showed white noise. What's more, all of his copies disappeared, and I never saw him or anyone like him again. I've heard about snake people being in the upper areas of business and government, but I got a serious chill thinking about what they would want by taking their game all the way down to the bottom, watching over ordinary people like me that blow in and out of the wind like litter. Are they keeping tabs on all of us that closely? And what kind of voodoo was it that knocked me out? A spoken word cut my lights out. Maybe that's how they work. Maybe that's part of how they hide in the broad daylight. They don't just blend in. They got some kind of voodoo magic going on. I don't know. Like some sort of supernatural power. Look out if you keep seeing someone familiar on public transportation. They might just be a sleeper cell, waiting, listening, watching. I remember in 5th grade, we got a substitute teacher that stayed much longer than any sub should have. She was large and loud, and the only part of her that wasn't ridiculously big was her feet. Her thighs were like freak of nature beets that had slender roots for her to walk on. We kept asking her when Mrs. Wimmer was going to come back. She would just tell us soon enough, but we lost track of how long our real teacher was absent. It had to have been weeks, One day, she told us that we're going to watch a film so amazing that we would watch it for the duration of the day, breaking only for lunch and recess. I had no idea what kind of film would run for so long. Just before she started up the film, I had to get up and use the bathroom. I should have asked for permission, but it hit me so hard that I couldn't risk a no. When I got back, the television rack was already in front of the class, and white static filled the screen. Those of you old enough to remember those days know that meant the video was starting soon. But the video never started. I stared, patiently waiting for the black leader of the first few inches of film to be read. It never did. While I was waiting, everyone in the classroom burst out into laughter. It died down. It was as if something funny had happened on the TV. It happened again. I looked into the static with confusion. There was nothing there. No sound, nothing. It was one of those screens that were rounded. Such were the old makes. In a corner, I saw a reflection of the lamp at the teacher's desk, and the teacher's face lit up by it. And the reflection, distorted all kinds of ways, was something that made me catch my breath once I worked it out. Something just as scaly and hideous as a crocodile was sitting at that desk. I whirled around to see the very human teacher sitting behind the desk, but she was looking straight at me, and the eyes I saw then were the same eyes I saw in the corner of the TV screen reflection. There was more laughter around me from everybody, and the teacher smiled, a very evil, sinister smile. I feigned illness for as long as possible, until my act fell apart. By then, weeks later, there wasn't a classroom to go back to. One of my classmates went on to do extremely violent acts. His excuse was that the teacher had taught him both through lessons and through videos that it was the right thing to do. As far as I know, that substitute teacher was never known of. I've used Google and white pages, and all else using what little information about her I could find. It's like tracking down a ghost, or a chameleon that disappears into the background. Either way, seeing that crocodile of a person left me terrified, and I have no idea if she came from this earth, or another planet, or the pits of hell itself. All I know is that it, assuming that's what it was, disguised itself as a person, because its intentions were not the same. I am very proud of my Native American heritage and have dedicated many of my years to researching as much as I can about my grandparents and their amazing folklore and stories. Tons of incredible legends live and breathe. A lot of it is downright fascinating, but some is absolutely terrifying. Thankfully, I have yet to find anybody who has had real-life experiences with a Wendigo, and to be honest, I hope to hell that I never do. But another creature that has given me many sleepless nights after researching it is something called the Pukwudgie. Now, you might be asking, why would a tiny, mythical woodland spirit scare me so much? Well, the reason is that, unlike the Wendigo, I have a first-person encounter story, and the person who saw it was my grandfather. Now, my grandparents grew up on the res back before they moved into the city, where my mom was eventually born. My grandfather recalls spending hours as a kid playing in the beautiful surrounding woodland. It was much simpler times, and without the technology that is just second nature to children these days, they would have to entertain themselves for hours on end with nothing but the woods and sticks, sometimes building forts, sometimes playing hide-and-go-seek, and other times children would be left to explore the great outdoors, as it should be. Most kids, however, found themselves playing hide-and-go-seek. They'd split into teams and run off into the woods. My granddad held the record for being the longest, and he wasn't about to let that slide into somebody else's hands. Running as fast as he could, he managed to cover a surprising amount of ground before he could no longer hear the shouts of 99, 100, coming, ready or not. He'd ended up in a fairly densely covered area, and was happy it would take a while to be discovered. Backing into the undergrowth, he was almost entirely covered in foliage. Boy, was he happy, he tells me. One by one, he could hear the calls and shouts of others being found, and it was hard not to laugh or even call out with glee. He was well on his way to a new record. That was for sure. But that changed when he heard a noise. To start with, he naturally presumed he was about to be discovered by another kid. So, he crouched down even further, hoping they'd walk past him without spotting him. He could still hear the sounds of his buddies running and the occasional "gotcha" from afar, and he began to try and work out which of the voices from the seeking team he couldn't place. Once he heard all three calling to the others, he figured he must have been joined by a nosy rabbit, or something. He wasn't at all scared at this point, just hoped the critter didn't give him away. More snuffling and crunching followed, much to his annoyance. He had the perfect hiding spot, and was about to be outed by a rabbit. He was also doing his damnedest to not sneeze, despite not being able to see a flower anywhere. There was a really strong floral scent, which was making his nose itch like crazy. And that was when he saw him. Now, I need you to bear in mind something. My grandfather was, 1, just a small boy at the time, and 2, crouched on the floor. This him that appeared barely came up to his eye level, but being short was the only unusual thing about him. The small man appeared to be gray in color, and his back and the top of his head were covered in spikes, like a porcupine. He had beady little black eyes, a large bulbous nose, and a sinister grin on his large oversized mouth. And my granddad knew exactly what this ominous little creature was. A Pukwudgie. And he was petrified. You see, he had been told that if you ever encountered one of these creatures, you had to be extremely careful. If you made one wrong move and made them angry, they could and will kill you. And you wouldn't even be free after that tragedy. They would keep control of your spirit for an eternity. Needless to say, my granddad did what any terrified kid would do in that situation. He began to break down and cry. He was terrified, and just this mere presence would be enough for the creature to curse him. He burst into tears. He'll never know if that act was enough to appease this creature, that somehow, by displaying that level of fear and submersion, he had awarded the creature some sort of respect. But the little gray man looked at him. That awful grin, still plastered on his face, simply disappeared. Poof into the air, gone. Too frightened to move, my grandfather stayed there for another 10 minutes or so until his buddies found him. At first, they thought he must have been hurt. Discovering your friend, sobbing, with tears and snot all over your face, curled up on the floor was not what they were expecting. Having managed to calm him down enough to ascertain he wasn't physically injured, they took him home. Only in the sanctum of his own four walls did he finally feel brave enough to recount what exactly happened. His friends listened in awe, whilst his parents exchanged knowing and worried looks. Thankfully, nothing more came of the encounter, and he had not been cursed or attracted the creature to continue to play tricks on him. It took a long time for any of the kids to go back into those woods, but they never saw him again. I love listening to your stories, and I will bet you that most others tuning into this will have heard of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, you name it. But I wonder what they might make of my story, or you for that matter. In fact, it was actually around 5 years ago now that I was driving home from a long evening shift. You see, I had my own experience with something that I can't explain, and I think it was something other than a Sasquatch. It's very typical. These stories always seem to happen at night, with no one else around to verify it. But I guess that's why so many of these things exist and haven't been hunted to extinction yet. So, there I am, minding my own business and driving pretty fast, since there is barely any other cars on the road with me. I'm singing along to some rock tune on the radio, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, headlights on full beam, as it's hella dark. I remember having to slow down as it had begun to rain. So, I hit the wipers on. Just because there was nobody else around didn't mean that I wanted to end up in a ditch. I cursed as the rain got heavier and heavier, because it was now making it even harder to see the damn road. To be fair, I'd driven this route so often, I could almost do it by memory. But you can never take the chance that a deer, or something larger, could take out your car and might just choose the exact moment to run out in front of you. And, as if by magic, that was exactly what happened. Only, if this was magic, it would be the black kind, with pentagrams and satanic vigils. I slammed on my brakes quickly, and how I didn't skid into it, I'll never know. Stopping distance in the heavy rain is a lot more than when my foot hit that pedal, that's for sure. The car came to a stop, literally, right in front of this thing. I say thing because there's no other accurate words to really describe this creature. At first, due to its size, I thought it must be a man. But despite this initial presumption, as the wipers cleared the windshield, and with the powerful headlights on full beam, I could clearly see whatever this thing was in no way, shape, or form a human being. Due to the dark and the artificial light from the car, I was unable to determine exactly what color its fur was. Yes, that's right. It was covered in fur, like that of a bear. But this was no bear. I think it was gray, but to be honest, it could have been a bluish hue. It was huge. Whilst as I was careening towards it, it looked man-size, and now it was right in front of me. I could clearly see it was well over 6 feet, more like 7 or 8, if I had to guess, maybe more. Its head and face, well, again, it's hard to describe, as I am pretty sure my mind was desperately trying to rationalize all of it. But it looked like a wolf almost, resplendent with giant wolf-like teeth and bright yellow eyes. So, apart from the fact that there was a giant gray-blue bipedal wolf standing in front of my car, I hear your listeners shouting werewolf or dogman. Well, here's the kicker. Staring right at me, just when I thought I couldn't possibly be any more afraid. It, and I kid you not, this thing had wings. You heard me. This giant blue bipedal wolf-faced creature had wings that resembled that of a gargoyle, like what you'd see in movies. Bat-like, tears and holes in them. Disgusting. It stood its ground, staring at me through the windshield, just gawking, a blank expression. No, I didn't try anything. This thing just seemingly looked aggressive. I was afraid to make any move. So, I did the only thing that I could think of. I didn't try to run it over, but this thing, whatever I was looking at, looked strong enough to pick up the car. And I didn't think for one moment that I could harm it, even if I tried to. Knowing this creature, had I rammed my car into it, I'd probably only destroy the front of my vehicle. So, I rammed my hand down on the horn and blasted it over and over, hoping for the best. When you're in a state of immense fear and panic, well, your brain kind of goes haywire. And you know what? Startling it at the time seemed to do the job, as it gave me one stare, a malevolent look, and took off. I sat there for just a moment, trying to stop my hands from shaking, and then speeding off, burning whatever was left on my tires. At that moment, I didn't care about the wet roads. I just needed to haul out of there. Thankfully, I made it back in one piece, and you bet that I went straight to the fridge and downed a couple of beers. I'll never know exactly what I saw out there, but I can never forget its face. Its image, its entirety is forever burned in my mind. This is just a quick story that I'm sending you, but nevertheless, it is something that I will never forget. So please, hear me out. About 6 months ago, I was lying in bed one night, tossing and turning, and for some reason, unable to drift off to sleep. This wasn't wholly unusual when my husband, who's a cop, is on a late shift. So, I accepted that I was likely going to just lie there until I heard the key in the door. But at least I had one thing to keep me company while I waited: the baby monitor. The fact I could hear super cute gurgling from the baby and contented little snores from the toddler helped soothe me. It comforted me, even if I could not sleep when their daddy wasn't home. At least they could. As I was lying there listening, feeling thankful it was such a still night, as I could clearly hear both of them breathing, there was a sudden bang. Now, the toddler insists on sleeping surrounded by toys, so it isn't exactly unusual for them to start rolling off the bed during the nighttime, and the baby seemed to be used to it. I waited to see if there was a follow-up noise before I padded down to their room and risked disturbing their slumber. Nothing, and all was quiet, except their little cooing noises for a few minutes, and then a bang. This bang, though, was so loud that it caused all the lights on the monitor to shine. Still not concerned at this point, more like hoping to hell the toddler hadn't fallen out of bed, I headed into the room, still being quiet as a mouse. As I peered around the door, I could just make out their sleeping forms by the low beam emitted from their nightlight. Both were in bed, not that the baby could get out of the crib anyway, and both still fast asleep, although the toddler was making those that I am going to wake up mumbling sounds. I couldn't see anything on the floor when I heard the bang again. As I was now in the room, I could ascertain it was coming from the window. At this point, I was feeling a little unnerved, but more still hoping to God whatever it was didn't wake up both of my children. Tiptoeing over to the window, I moved the curtain slightly and peered out. What I saw next, I will never forget. Thank God I had closed the window that night, because the banging was caused by a hand. A large hairy hand, covered in what appeared to be thick, coarse, dark hair. Maybe it was fur. I couldn't exactly tell. And to be honest, I was so startled and frightened, I don't think it really mattered. I couldn't help myself. I screamed, and of course, woke up both the children, who began crying immediately. I grabbed them both and slammed the door, racing into my room and gathering them up close to me. I heard 3 more loud bangs on the window through the baby monitor. Then nothing. After their initial shock, both children soon fell back asleep. The toddler next to me and the baby fast asleep in my arms. That's how my husband found us, just a couple of hours later after he finished his shift. Being a police officer, he grabbed his flashlight and gun and made a very thorough check of the inside and outside of the property. Coming back inside, he made sure everything was locked up and suggested that I try and get some good earned rest. I am not entirely sure that he believed that I had seen a hairy clawed hand scratching at the window, trying to get in. He is far more used to dealing with human monsters. Oh, and there's one more thing. We live in an apartment building on the 8th floor, and there's nothing outside the window except air. So what the hell did we see exactly? I'll never know. I guess this story begins when I was out for my morning run. I came across a flyer stapled to one of the telephone poles that actually looked recent. Nobody really put things up on these old splintered posts, at least around here. It was the work of distraught parents that weren't content to let law enforcement handle things on their own. It was a notice of a missing little girl from our area, written very strangely. I saw the official missing poster at the post office. The writing, much more tame. I felt for the people involved. I honestly did. The distress they were in was palpable, even to me, and I had never even met the family. The child was something out of a storybook. Blonde hair and blue eyes, pictured in a set of pink overalls with a white heart in the center. Soon enough, though, I couldn't take 3 steps without seeing or hearing something related to the supposed kidnapping. I tried not to think about it while I was out for my morning jog. I don't mean to be cold. I just have to have a span of time where the world's poison isn't on my mind. So, when I came home later, I found something on my front doorstep. A large teddy bear. The kind that would never fit in a household washer. I looked it over, and there was no sign of who it came from, or where it came from. I just wondered if it had been delivered by mistake. I noticed that it was hardly new. It was old, and didn't smell pleasant. I couldn't think of who hated me enough to cart a heavy, musty, plush teddy bear onto my front step. But a new thought chilled me. Did they know my morning routine, and thus know when to drop the bear off when I wasn't around? Then, I speculated that I was being watched. It was a horrible feeling, and I brushed it off. So, I dragged the smelly thing out by the trash bin for the next morning pickup. 1 minute, the garbage truck was there. The next, it was gone. And so was the darn bear. I had uneasy dreams that night. Something dark had burrowed into my sleeping mind. I was dreaming about crying coming from somewhere inside the house, and I couldn't find it, no matter how I searched, and it was getting louder, and I was afraid that I would get the attention of the neighbors, leading them to suspect that I was guilty of something. I awoke in a cold sweat to find that the crying was indeed no dream. It was soft, but real, and very much so present. I couldn't find where it was coming from, and I fought back a tide of panic, telling myself that there had to have been some rational explanation. So, I walked into my bedroom for the 5th time and froze when I finally noticed the window. There was the bear before me, staring in. I lost myself for a moment, the terror finally overriding all my senses. I thought to call the police, but what would I tell them? There was a bear in my window? The crying was coming from the bear. I steeled myself, thinking that this was one of those toys that recorded sounds and plays them back. Surely, this was just a trick. When I stepped outside with the bear, the crying had ceased completely. I was shaking, and it wasn't from the rain. I gave the bear a good frisking, and it did seem to have some weight inside of it that wasn't meant to be there. Maybe the make of the recording device that would tell me more. The bear was already cut open, the folds seamlessly pressing together. Something that smelled awful welled up into my face as I reached inside. The source was the decomposing body of a little girl who went missing, wearing the exact same pink overalls that I'd seen in the poster. Hi, I may not even be submitting this story to the right podcast. You seem to deal with all things monsters. I dealt with a real monster a few years back when I was only 8 years old. I'm 14 now. My mother loves thrift and resale shops. Whenever she goes, she has to take me along, for some reason. I get it, that cheap stuff is cool, but how much stuff does anybody really need? Just because it's cheap doesn't mean you have to buy it. But anyway, she gave me the usual line of it. If I go with her this time, she'll get me anything I wanted. I was 8. It wasn't like I could refuse and stay home by myself, which, in hindsight, would have been nice. So, I'm dragged to yet another resale shop. They more or less knew my mom by name there. She went straight for the clothes, while I found my way over to the toys. Something caught my eye. It was a magic 8-ball in the hands of a plush old-fashioned clown. To my delight, the clown was attached to an 8-ball by magnets. I had always wanted a magic 8-ball, and here I would get a cool clown doll along with it. For once, I was happy to be along for one of my mom's thrift binges. I played with the 8-ball often, and put it back in the hands of the clown when I was done. In fact, I named him Herman. One night, I was having fun with the 8-ball rather late, asking it questions and shaking it under the covers by the light of my useless track phone. I froze in place when I heard some sort of shuffling in my room. It didn't sound like a full-grown person was around, but it didn't sound like an animal either. I couldn't place it, so I stayed under the covers and waited. I tried to lighten things up a bit, and I silently asked the 8-ball if the noise was Herman. It showed up as yes, definitely. I fought off a shiver and forced a smile. I again asked if it was Herman, and he was looking for me in particular. It repeated its previous answer. I asked if Herman knew where I was, and it said, very doubtful. Then, I asked what Herman wanted, since I knew it could only answer yes or no, or so I thought. It said, "Better not tell you now." And if you don't believe me, Google it. It's an actual answer on some makes of 8-balls. I began trembling, and I had to fight it off. I asked the 8-ball if Herman was going to hurt me, and it said, "It is certain." No. This was getting far too strange. Surely it wouldn't answer the same question twice. I asked it, "Has Herman found me yet?" And it answered, "It is decidedly so." I threw off my covers so that I could turn on my bedroom light. When I did, I totally lost it, since Herman was sitting on the foot of my bed, but facing me where I was at the light switch. My parents came to my rescue. They naturally wrote the whole thing off as a bad dream, and I promptly threw away Herman and the 8-ball, and I never bothered to replace either one of them. Well, the story gets even more interesting as time had gone on. See, I kind of forgot about the whole Herman thing, until a few years later, I guess I found out that there was a rather large group of gypsies who had been donating many of the items and toys to that same thrift store that my mother went to. If you know anything about gypsies and their culture, they are heavily involved in maybe not necessarily witchcraft, like black masses and killing children, but they do practice voodoo and magic to an extent. So, I almost wonder if maybe somehow, being around that culture, there was a demon that had found its way inside that Herman doll in traditional horror movie fashion. I don't know. That was real enough for me. What I dealt with inside that doll was a real living entity. What exactly was its purpose? I'm not sure, but it seemed intent on wanting to hurt me. Please excuse my lack of knowledge, which is why I'm coming to you with questions. Which I should ask you, if there is such a thing as a shadow cryptid. I call it that because I don't know what else to refer to it as. I had a very recent experience with one of these shadow cryptids, and it's just crazy enough to be worth sharing. So I checked into a cheap, single-story hotel during a business trip I was on. I was dog-tired, and staying on the road just wasn't an option if I wanted to survive. I was in bed, lights out, when I heard movement somewhere. It seemed to be where I had hung up my hat and coat next to the door. I thought that maybe a rat or something had gotten in my room and was going to chew holes in my good coat. Moonlight was now streaming in and throwing a huge white square on the just spot I suspected the sounds to be coming from. And I didn't see any rodents. But I did see movement. I shouted on instinct, "Hey!" A slithering shape withdrew and rose up to briefly take the shape of a person before melting into something like a pool of ink, and then finally snaking out of my room through the crack underneath the door. I pinched myself to make sure that I wasn't asleep and dreaming. I got up, and against my better judgment, to check out what I had just seen. Opening the hotel room door, I stepped into the hallway and looked around. I saw it, slithering there on the floor. It stretched out like a sheet of dried black rubber into the shape of a person, yet again. A single red eye blinked at me a few times. Once again, it collapsed into a puddle and began racing away very quickly. I couldn't tell you for all the money in the world why I decided to chase after it. I was more interested than terrified. It was just too crazy, and I probably sound crazy for not ducking back into my room and staying there. I chased it, but it had no trouble of staying ahead of me. Soon, I became winded, developed a side stitch, but I wasn't catching up. I also started to realize that the hallway seemed awfully long for a place that small. In the moonlight, I could easily read the numbers on the doors. They were repeating. By virtue of some nightmare law come true, I was running through the same repeating segment of hallway over and over again. It was when I realized this that I think I heard some laughter from the shadow up ahead, except it sounded very deep in pitch and distorted, kind of like somebody playing a recording of a laughter, pitch shifted, and played through a loudspeaker. I gave up the chase before I fell over unconscious. The simple act of turning the opposite direction brought me right back to my room. I overslept, waking up way too late to depart on time properly. I don't know if this was a fever dream or what. I tried to dig up some information on beings called shadow people, but here, the resemblance is very marginal. I get sick when I come near small, single-story hotels that look like they could have a history. So, I'm sending this to you, in hopes you can maybe debunk what exactly I had an encounter with. Because I know, for sure, this wasn't a dream. I did come in contact with something evil. Hi. Me and my twin sister have a story for you about a living shadow that used to give us trouble. We're identical twins. She looks like me, and I look just like her. We were staying with my grandmother for an extended period due to fire damage to our house. My grandmother took care of us, while my mother and father saw to getting our home back and up and running as soon as possible, however long that would take. I don't even remember what woke me up at night, but I had come to just in time to see my sister floating through the air. I thought that surely grandmother was carrying her, and I just couldn't see her for some reason. When my sleeping sister floated across the open window, I could see that she was being held by some kind of being of shadow. I didn't think. I automatically yelled out at the thing to put my sister down and leave her alone. This thing, whatever it was, jumped as if it had honestly been startled. My sister landed on the foot of my bed and didn't awake from her sleep. I was worried that she was hurt, but she wasn't. She actually slept through the entire thing. I thought that was the end of that. Well, it wasn't. I dreamt the very next night about being a small infant and being in the arms of some adult that I could not see the face of. I felt warm and safe, and even drowsy, at least until I woke up. I wasn't in my bed. I was floating through the air, feeling a cold grasp around my body. I struggled and fought. I tried to scream but couldn't. Something chilly and strong covered my mouth. At last, I fell to the floor with a hard thud, even though my heart was pounding. I could not think of anything else to do but find my way back to bed. This repeated every single night. I would wake up as I was being carried out of my bed by the shadow that tried to carry off my sister. I woke up a little later each time, and after about a week, I could tell that it was carrying me towards the cellar staircase at the far end of the house. I tried telling my grandmother about it, but she didn't seem to comprehend what I even spoke to her. I didn't know what to do. By stopping it from carrying off my sister, I must have angered it, since it only bothered with me from then on out. The night before our parents came to get us back for good,
I had woken up just outside the cellar door at the bottom of the staircase. Mother and father weren't a minute too soon. I was okay, and I wasn't. I was fine, and I was traumatized. Thinking about the whole thing was like reflecting on a dream, and yet no dream ever made me shiver that much. I'm fairly certain this was some sort of poltergeist. Last winter, I did a coffee roast in class. It seemed like such a great idea at the time. Meeting new people, learning something new, getting to try my very own coffee. The course was held in London, near Ealing, in a kitchen at the top of a block of flats. It wasn't a bad location, but it was a pretty rundown building. I was attending with one of my girlfriends, and we were both very excited. It's been months since the class, but I still can't quite comprehend what happened. There are some days it doesn't feel real, like I'm living in somebody else's body. At times, it feels like someone has taken over my mind. Every day, things for me have become dark and tormenting. I can't look at children's play parks like I used to, for my innocence no longer exists. Life has become dark, wretched, scary, and even lonely. My arms are filled with icy fear coursing down my veins, and I'm constantly bumping into things and dropping things. I feel like a ticking time bomb, a myriad of stress that is heading at a rapid pace into what clearly feels like a brick wall. I used to be easygoing and airy, but lately, things have gotten worse. Ever since I saw what I saw at that class, the instructor, a Brazilian man who was very flirty with all the women, and even a bit inappropriate at times. What happened was he whispered into my ear that he needed a special favor. My stomach nodded, as I don't know what he was going to come out with. He then told me he needed me to go into the freezer and get some ice. I laughed, and he pointed me in the direction of the freezer, which was just down a corridor and next to the bathroom. It was an odd place for the freezer, and I realized that I couldn't hear any of the others in the class. So, I walked into the freezer and kept it ajar by pulling the fire extinguisher off the wall and setting it down. It was so cold. Go figure. I looked around for the bags of ice that Mario the instructor told me about. I spotted them and grabbed them and went to leave. When I closed the freezer door and put the fire extinguisher back onto the wall, I noticed a strange sound coming from one of the bedrooms. It was like a horrible grunting or groaning. Not the sound of what you would assume. It was like an animal. But there was no way this could be a domesticated pet. I've always loved animals, so I wasn't initially afraid, just curious. I continued standing there. A waft of something burning poured out into the corridor. It kind of resembled burning plastic or material. That was when I panicked, as I thought the entire place was on fire. I knew that I had no chance other to investigate, and that the owners wouldn't mind at all. I walked into what appeared to be the master bedroom, covered in blood, orange quilts, curtains, and carpet. There was an accompanying bathroom where I could hear grunts and groans, and even smoke. What the hell was going on? I threaded carefully into the bathroom, and my heart fell into my knees at the sight in front of me. It was a snake, writhing around in the bathtub, knocking over stuff, and the bathroom curtain was slightly on fire at the bottom. Only this was not a snake. This thing had two heads, one of each end of its body. It was a two-headed serpent of some kind, except again, not like you would think traditionally, but a head on each end. My mouth gaped open as I took in the horror of whatever this thing was. The creature was now gliding on the ground, up and down the bathroom poles. It was well over 8 feet. Its eyes too were orange and small, little slits which seemed to glimmer and dart around the room. I wondered what I should do. It was clearly a hazard having this animal in the house. I almost wondered if this was his pet and had escaped. Surely such a thing was a danger. I looked around and spotted an axe next to one of the fire alarms. I then contemplated about whether I should try and kill it. As if reading my thoughts, it looked over to me, dead in the eyes with both heads, and both heads opened their mouths, exposing an extremely large set of fangs and an opening where no doubt swallowed and it could devour its entire prey. It bolted towards me, and at that moment, I was able to step backwards and shut the door. I ran out of the room, back up the corridor, panting and utterly breathless. I looked backwards to see if the thing had managed to break out of the room and follow me. Thankfully, it had not. I did hear a thrashing and crashing sound, as if it was banging itself against the bathroom door, trying to get itself out. I had clearly aggravated the beast, and it did not like being disturbed. So, I managed to discreetly grab my coat and pulled my friend out before we went home, careful not to attract any attention. I had dropped the ice all over the bedroom. Mario texted me later that evening to see what happened, but I rang him back and told him all about the supposed snake. He then informed me that he didn't live at the property, but he went down to the freezer in the bedroom after and saw the ice scattered all over the ground. He then checked with the owners. They denied owning any pet, let alone a two-headed serpent. Mario then accused me of taking drugs in the freezer. My friends too thought I had lost my mind completely. Because the last year has been so crazy, I haven't really had time to fully process everything that has happened. Look, all I know is I saw something that was real, monstrous, savage, and clearly bizarre. I've booked into a counselor in hopes that they could shed some light on what happened. I have also looked into two-headed snakes online, but by our reports, the kind I saw only exist in mythology. I hope that my account can shed some light and hopefully attract some media attention, so maybe others who have had similar experiences can come forward and not being afraid of being cast off as crazy. Even though my story sounds hokey or even crazy by many, I stand by it firmly and will gladly tell anybody about what happened. Who knows? Maybe there truly are others out there who have seen the same things that I have. When I was just a kid, I constantly found myself at my grandmother's house. I was always staying there. She was such an angel, but unfortunately, passed away back in 2014. Her house was surrounded by fields and stretches of land that seemed to go on for an eternity. This was rural Alabama, and we ran barefoot through the fields with not a care in the world. Looking back, it was such a special childhood, free from all the distractions, and very little access to screens or even technology. I felt as free as a bird on my grandmother's farm. But something happened as a child. Something disturbing, which I know I need to address as a grown woman. I believe that I encountered a real-life reptilian witch. I know I sound crazy, that if I give my name on this account, people will find me and think I've utterly lost my mind. But you don't understand. This memory has been stored in my mind and deep in my soul for well over 20 years now, and I feel like it's the time to discuss it. So, going back in time to the springtime of 1998, I want to say late April, or perhaps early May. I would have been around 9 years old. Grandmother's house was surrounded by large fields, as I said, and on this particular day, I was going down to the apple tree, as she wanted to bake us some apple pie. So, I was running down to the apple tree and climbed up on the branches. The apples were green, and as I took a big bite, they tasted of spring. I filled my basket and got ready to take them back to my grandmother's house. I heard a chirping behind me. It was the most bizarre thing. I turned around, but could see nothing. Then the chirping happened and started up again. I turned around. Still, nothing was there except the stretches of long green grass. When I turned back to grab my basket, there was a scaly hand touching one of the apples. It was green and scaly and snake-like. I shuddered and looked up. Before me was this god-awful demonic-looking thing. The only way I could describe it was skeletal, and it was wrapped in long black shawl. Whether it was a man or woman, I could not tell. Its eyes were open, bloodshot and yellow, fixed on me without blinking. The head was totally bald, showing scaly reptile-like skin and face, but almost like it was rotted away. There almost appeared to be little worms under its skin. The teeth were rotten and fang-like, and its skin was dark green to deathly pale. I tried to move back, but this creature, whatever it was fixed its hand on me, and seemed to almost rock back and forth as it attempted to pull me closer. I had no idea what it was going to do. Perhaps eat me, kill me, kidnap me. I had no idea. From the creature's head, 4 large purple horns shot up, and this creature continued to grab me and hold me with a viciousness and savagery. I closed my eyes and prepared myself to die. When it wanted me, I was not sure. The next thing I remember, it released its grip from me and retreated into the bushes before disappearing. My hands were bleeding, and I had a large wound. I looked up to the hill and could see my grandmother staring down at me. She ran to hold me. I began crying and started to explain to her what had happened. She told me she saw it all. We went back to her house, and she told me a very similar thing had happened when she was a little girl. It was deeply traumatic. She told me this, and she never quite got over it. Grandmother and I would talk about the incident for many years to come, right up until her passing. We both never veered that we saw something supernatural, demonic, and terrifying. At times, this creature still appears in my nightmares, and I wake up imagining its scaly hand locked over mine. I still have a car where it struck its force into my childish hands. I am writing this now, many years after the incident, and I hope that somebody else can come forward and tell me they have maybe seen something similar. At my grandmother's funeral, we also baked an apple pie in her honor. I went up to the attic and had the urge to look out at the old tree, now neglected with age. You wouldn't believe this, but I could have swore that I saw the same strange figure submerged at the bottom of the trunk. I just shuddered and walked away, not wanting to see any more, and hoping that I wasn't truly seeing the horrors of my past. I am lucky I survived. I hope that I can connect with anybody else who has seen something that they can't necessarily comprehend. I hope my description is thorough enough. Like I said, the best way for me to accurately paint it is it was half reptile, half human, but it looked dead and skeletal, with patches of flesh missing, and what appeared to be little bugs under its skin. It's like it was a living dead creature of some kind. It was terrifying. What happened to me as a child vividly lives on in my memory. I know it was real. It still reaps trauma into my everyday life, even as I write this.